who've joined us tonight for this very important conversation. We are delighted to host this conversation. We're joined by Professor Peter Anderson, Carly Jaya and Joe Sambono, and they'll be formally introduced by Darcel Russell, the AEU's Federal Aboriginal Education Officer, in a short while in terms of the presentation. So just a reminder about housekeeping. I know we're quite familiar now with Zoom and webinars, but if you would like to put your camera on, that would be wonderful so that we can see who we have online. And also if you could just keep your microphone on mute unless you're seeking the call. So we're going to proceed with a panel presentation, and then there will be an opportunity for a Q&A session afterwards, which we'll facilitate through the chat function, or you can wave at us and we'll try and catch your question and go live to you for that question as well. Colleagues, I note that this conversation also takes place in the week following the 30th anniversary of the release of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody on the 15th of April 1991. And it's a national travesty that more than 470 Aboriginal people have died in custody since the release of the report 30 years ago. And on behalf of the AEU, I pay our respects and send our sympathies to their families, and in particular, the families of the 5 people who have most recently died in custody. And I also extend our solidarity to their family members who have somehow found the strength to campaign for justice at a time when they should be mourning their loved ones. It's a timely reminder that 10 of the recommendations from the Royal Commission relate to education, and one in particular relates to the conversation this evening, 295, that all teacher training courses include courses which will enable student teachers to understand that Australia has an Aboriginal history and Aboriginal viewpoints on social, cultural and historical matters, and to teach the curriculum which reflects those matters. That in-service training courses for teachers be provided so that teachers may improve their skills, knowledge and understanding to teach curricula which incorporates Aboriginal viewpoints on social, cultural and historical matters, and that Aboriginal people should be involved in the training courses both at a student, teacher and in-service level. The AEU has long advocated for governments in Australia to ensure that all teachers have access to minimum mandatory course standards for teachers, both in terms of ensuring that teachers have a comprehensive knowledge in Aboriginal history and Aboriginal viewpoints on social, cultural and historical matters, as the recommendation from the Royal Commission states, and in ensuring that teachers are deploying appropriate pedagogical strategies when teaching First Nations students in Australia's education systems. But like most of the other recommendations, there's unfortunately been very little progress in the implementation of the education-specific recommendations from the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. And while the national education infrastructure has changed over the years, the central tenet of the Royal Commission's recommendations is a reaffirmation of one of the central goals of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Education Policy, which states that at every stage of the application of the National Aboriginal Education Policy, the utmost respect be paid to the first long-term goal expressed in the policy, that is, to establish effective arrangements for the participation of Aboriginal parents and community members in decisions regarding the planning, delivery and evaluation of preschool, primary and secondary education services for their children. That it be recognised that the aims of the policy are not only to achieve equity in education for Aboriginal people, but also to achieve a strengthening of Aboriginal identity, decision-making and self-determination. And it is unlikely that either of these aims can be achieved without the achieving of the other. So 3 decades onwards, we should be outraged at the divergence by governments at all levels and all persuasions from these central goals, which are as self-evident today as the day that the report was published. However, we must and should rightfully acknowledge the collective progress that has been made and the often unacknowledged contribution that the expertise of our First Nations colleagues make every day to our sector as they live and breathe this work. And so I'm delighted to launch this webinar and to invite Darcel to introduce our panel presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Karina, and my apologies in advance for my finger. I'm on my phone because my speaker's not working on my computer. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce my colleagues and friends, Peter Anderson, Carly Jaya and Joe Sambono, who are here to have a critical conversation with us. And in the introduction of this conversation, I'd like to acknowledge Peter's contribution to the title of the seminar. We've been talking about bringing people together to have these sorts of conversations for quite a while now. And I guess with the advent of COVID, Zoom has provided us with a necessary solution. So I welcome everybody from across the country. I actually have forgotten to acknowledge country myself and acknowledge myself. I am a Guruntul woman, and I am from Minjarrabad, Tarangeri, North Stradbroke Island, Quandamooka country in Queensland. I live and work on Wurundjeri country, and it's very cold down here today. So look, without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Professor Peter Anderson. How this format of the webinar is going to work is that Professor Anderson is going to give us some introductory remarks, and then we'll go on to a panel discussion for 30, maybe 35, 40 minutes, depending on how long you talk for, Joe Sambono. And then we'll go into questions from the audience, which we'll receive by chat. Karina, is that right? Can you? Yes, we'll receive those by chat, and Karina will be chairing that session for us. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Professor Peter Anderson, who is the director and director of the Karumba Institute at QUT and Professor of Education. Thank you very much, Peter.
Great. Thank you, Darcel. So firstly, my name is Peter Anderson. I'm a Warlpiri and Moonpatha man from Northern Territory. So my father's country is Central Desert Tanami area. So you know, if you think Yundamui, where our homeland is probably about another 100 k's west, you know, beautiful country, very red. And then on my mother's side, I'm actually crocodile dreaming. From the Daly River area, tiny little place called Peridare, and I see someone here, Matt, from Pepmanati School. And so I done my teaching out that way on country with my family. And this, you know, this journey for me has been a long, you know, to this conversation. I was really quite glad when Darcel got Carly, Joe and I together to sort of just have a yarn about what's going on. You know, what's happening. And, you know, as Blackfellas, we are very patient. We are patient people. And I think the time is right in terms of what are we actually doing in our profession? You know, how are we responsive to? I mean, we're always responsive to government and whoever gets in on the day. I mean, we all know the new government comes in, the first people they're going to start kicking are teachers, nurses, you know, and suddenly we have to pivot and, you know, move in another direction. And that there's a new curriculum framework that someone, you know, decided to maybe, you know, cut out a boomerang in cardboard instead of paper that week. But what we're actually, I don't think, talking about is we're not actually reflecting on ourselves, I guess, and making it known that, you know, teaching and education is actually a profession. It's, you know, our approach is pedagogically is scientific. You know, we are experts in what we do and we know how to do it. Regardless of, you know, things like, you know, new curriculum resources, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess my research over the years, only because I have been one of those kids who suddenly, you know, teachers want to ask me questions when I was at school. How do I do this? How do I do that? What curriculum resources can I use? So my research really is looking at how, particularly how non-Indigenous teachers are actually engaging in this space confidently. Aboriginal people, we want you to actually be able to do this work confidently, to be able to think about, changing this narrative of what education is in this country around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Historically, education for us, it's been done to us as part of the colonial project. The University of London, they have all of the curriculum documents from way back when, around, when Australia was colonised, and what they actually wanted First People to actually do. Far removed from, our knowledges, our peoples, and, how we're actually engaging in this space. And so one of the things I tend to look at to actually think about, how do I engage not only teachers, but also initial teacher education. So I spent probably 10 years at Monash heading up the Indigenous education and leadership space in the Faculty of Education, and teaching, in that time that I was at Monash, I think I only had probably 3 Indigenous students come through, one of the largest faculties in the country. So I had to actually think, okay, how am I going to create some change, and education as change. And then luckily enough, AETSL came out then at that time and was working on the standards. And I was tasked with talking to teachers about what are your fears, anxieties about these new standards coming out, and how do you actually do them? How do we move forward in this? Is to actually make it meaningful. And I think that the key thing here is, how do we make these policies meaningful in our practice? So one of the things when I was doing some curriculum mapping was to look at, at the first year level, many people, sort of knows the introduction to professions, etc., was to talk about, you've got the right to the child, you have, universal human rights, and all these different policies that govern our profession. But one of the things that was glaringly missing for me was the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and particularly the rights to education. And I found that through research over, time, and that once practitioners actually knew about things that actually govern our profession and that will make you a better teacher, the uptake and resistance to the Indigenous agenda in education changes. It's actually, what can I do? What can I do professionally? And it plays into, and I speak for myself, it's like, as a professional, as a teacher, I'm a certain personality type, I'm a helper. How do I do this? And sort of it's tapping into that goodwill, and it's tapping into how do we actually bolster the profession? How do we actually say, it's okay to make mistakes? You can actually ask somebody and actually, discern. Don't be ashamed. It's okay. You're not expected to be an expert. Now, within teacher education and education, there's probably only 26 of us in universities. Even fewer of us are at the, the professorial level. So it becomes then a bit of a numbers game, really, because there's not enough bodies to go around. And then in the profession at schools, you might have one Indigenous teacher and you're the go-to, and I can speak for my experience. I got discipline issues from the Indigenous kids across the school. I got NAIDOC week, Harmony Day, all of those different things. It's like, tag, you're it, and why aren't you doing it? And I think to actually have a coordinated approach at the school level, and we're thinking about our classroom practice, how we're embedding this across our curriculums, we're actually giving then our Indigenous learners a little bit of reprieve. We're constantly then not focusing on Indigenous learners and families, like, the school readiness. Why are Aboriginal children not ready for school? My question is, why aren't schools ready for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? Why aren't teachers offered professional development to confidently engage in this space? And the other thing is, you're not meant to be an expert, because we don't teach Indigenous education at faculty level anymore. So there's, I think a lot of it is nuances, and how do we actually say, you can do this? Because the common I think common themes coming up with teachers is, I'm not confident, I don't want to do the wrong thing. What if I say the wrong thing? Or, you know, like there's just these little things. And these, as educators, we know how to actually fix that. You know, we know how to actually build confidence. We know how to actually lift somebody up professionally to do that. And the other thing as well, I think, in all of these conversations as we're going along, is how we actually creating, you know, and I'm working on a piece of work now within education around creating an Indigenous organisational consciousness within a school, you know, without saying, well, I haven't got Indigenous kids in my class, therefore I don't have to do this. But really, how are we teaching our non-Indigenous learners around this rich history that is theirs as well? You know, how are we doing that? How are we sort of, you know, giving these kids who are going to be the next leaders in this country, you know, like skills like how do you actually engage with if somebody says something racist, or how do you know, do you know the country on which your school's at? These are quite simple things that we can do and build lessons around, you know, and because it is, and I think for all of us, as we know, and we can see professionally, it's a long game. We have to play, as I said in the beginning, we are very patient people, you know, and we're always looking to the future. You know, I know lots of colleagues that many people may know, like Paul Hughes, Annie K. Price, who've been doing this for so long, Peter Buckskin. You know, it's actually, sometimes change might not happen in our lifetime, and that's okay. But how are we setting this up for our learners? How are we actually sharing the load? How are we creating agency? And really, as educators, how are we recognised as agents of change in this colonial project? You know, in drawing on our profession, in drawing on our own skills and knowledge. It's sort of, you know, how do you connect head, heart, and hand almost in terms of the classroom practice? So I guess that's my sort of contextual sort of space in which I occupy, and, you know, really, how can we do this together? You know, because you know, Aboriginal teachers, it's probably 3 to 4 years in the, you know, in the profession before there's burnout. Indigenous academics is the same. So there's a systemic issue here around workloads, etc. So something to think about. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Peter. Now we might go more broadly to the panel discussion. And our panel tonight is Carly Jaya. Carly, I might just, after I've given you the spiel, I might just get you to introduce yourself, and then we'll, and maybe make a response to Peter if you feel like it, and then we'll go into the broader yarn a bit later on. But Carly is the Senior Advisor for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Education from the Australian Institute for Teacher and School Leadership. And Carly's work is all about the teaching standards at the moment. So we're very, very pleased to have her here tonight to talk about her work and talk about some other critical issues with us.
Thank you, Darcel. So yes, my name is Carly Jaya, and I'd just like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation here on Wurundjeri country. As Darcel said, I'm the Senior Advisor with AEU. I've been here for 2 years now. My country is Yidinji, Badrulag and Miriam, so I'm from far north Queensland. Also have my links to my grandmother's country on Murray Island and my grandfather's country on Bardu Island. So I've been working with AEU for a couple of years now, and the work that I was enticed into was around developing a culturally competent teaching workforce. And I don't think AEU really understood the brief when they took this work on. And when we started to unpack some of the issues, it was just like peeling back an onion and just seeing all the layers and the different issues that that kind of you know, fell out of all of that unpacking. So we've been designing a process around consulting with the profession, just gauging their understanding around cultural competency. And even the term cultural competency seems to be problematic. And then you go into the more broader issues around initial teacher education, the curriculum. So there is a range of factors that need to be considered when developing a culturally competent teaching workforce. So You know, the work around that Peter was talking, you know, Indigenous education, it needs collaboration. And we've come to this point in the work where we've realised there's a lot of work that's already been done. So we shouldn't be reinventing the wheel. We should be acknowledging the efforts of the mob that's come before us, the shoulders of the giants that we stand on. And I think it's just about revitalising some of that. And like I said, collaboration is key to all of this. I think we all need to come together to map out some of those issues and, you know, some of those opportunities. I'm sick of talking about the deficit discourse in Indigenous education. We need to look for opportunities rather than look at some of the excuses that we constantly hear in Indigenous education. So this work, I think, through cultural competency and through the work of AETSL, you know, we have access to the profession like we've never had before. There's a lot of traction in the work, and there's a lot of goodwill and intent around the work that we're delivering. So, you know, just hearing from the profession that racism in education is an issue. This isn't coming from blackfellas either. This is coming from non-Indigenous Australians saying there is an issue with racism in the education system in this country. You know, looking at other issues around, you know, all the existing research, what's already out there. And also, you know, we need to acknowledge the work that's has been done by our, you know, previous elders and that have, like Annie K. Price and Peter Buckskin. So there's a range of you know, opportunities to be able to still carry their legacy on. So I'm really excited about some of the possibilities that will come out from this work. Cultural competency by no means is a term that we're wedded to. That's terminology seems to be one of the major factors in this work, and whether or not it's the right terminology. So we're not AETSL's not coming out saying this is the work that we need to do. It's about negotiating, consulting with the profession and with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to be able to map the process forward. So it's been an interesting 2 years. We're coming to a culminating event with a national dialogue, which we're hosting in mid-May, which it's going to be a pretty exciting event. And we're really looking forward to bringing all those conversations that we've had through our national forums, as well as our submission process, and just kind of work with the profession and work with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to help us progress the work. So that's kind of where we're at the moment. So I'm really interested to, you know, hear some questions and, you know, some responses about some of the work and these critical kind of elements that we seem to overlook because we're all really focused on our little, I don't like the term silos, but I think sometimes we are focused on our own work and we forget about the broader picture. But how do we bring that in together? How do we all work together to be able to ensure that our kids are getting the right education, they're getting access to quality teaching, and our teachers, that we're enhancing their practice, we're making them better teachers, because they should be teaching all of our kids the same. So you know, Peter's approach around that rights-based education is an amazing approach. So we're looking forward to further discussion. Thanks, Darcel.
Thank you, Carly. And I'll pass on now to Jo Sambono, who's the curriculum specialist for ACARA, the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority. And Jo's been working on what he has called the space of the intellectual terra nullius, which is the Australian curriculum, and has been doing amazing work as Carly and Peter are doing both in their spaces, amazing work on curriculum elaborations for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So Jo, I'm really interested to hear what you've got to say as an introduction.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. My name's Jo Sambono. Identify as a jingly man from on my dad's side. Grandmother's jingly woman from out near Elliott Way, and on the grandfather's side, Malaccan. So Sambono. Everyone always thinks Sambono is Italian or something like that, but it's an Indonesian name. And then on the mum's side, a 10-pound pom. So lots of boat people in our family. both ends. But yeah, as Darcel mentioned, I'm currently working for the Australian curriculum. When I normally introduce myself, I'm normally pretty quick to say, although I work for ACARA, I'm but sometimes that gets a bit of a laugh. But yeah, the recent work was in the refinement of the science curriculum, and coming to some of the initial statements for tonight about things like some of the points made in the Royal Commission about making sure as a nation we know about each other, and even coming back to the Aboriginal Education Policy of 1989 and then to the Melbourne Education Declaration, is these common themes and these common calls that as a nation we know more and learn about who our own First Nations peoples are. So in my job in the Australian curriculum, I guess, is since the advent of the Australian curriculum, we've got 3 dimensions within it. And one of those dimensions is about us, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Histories and Cultures dimension. And that's I guess the architecture, or one of the ways we can make that come to life in classrooms. So I have a very passionate interest in that space and in that work. My role currently now is you'll all be aware that the Australian curriculum is undergoing its 6-year cycle of being reviewed. And my job has been to support those 8 learning areas and try and, I guess, identify errors and opportunities and omissions. And it's a monumental job, and it's one of immense national significance. But yeah, I won't keep talking. I'll keep it short for you, Darcel. You know, but that's where I'm. And as Carlia said, I'm keen to see where we go tonight, and really keen to receive questions about, especially things relating to the Australian curriculum.
Fantastic. So, look, I've actually just got a couple of, or maybe one, just in terms of timing. We'll see how we go. Just one question. I mean, in terms of making policy meaningful to our practice, which is what I think Peter said, and I think that. You know, in terms of teaching practice, what we've found is in fact the great recycling of policy, but also in terms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs more broadly, the impact of policy instability on classroom teachers, and in terms of that, I'm talking about, you know, is it whole language versus phonics? A government pulls out a policy and suddenly all teachers are expected to teach along that particular line. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, obviously, it's, you know, do you have will we fund your representative body or not? Will we listen to what you're saying or not? Et cetera, et cetera. So there's, as Carly said, multiple layers of challenges in terms of making policy meaningful to our practice. I think that what we do have, in fact, is a whole lot of goodwill in the profession, and a whole lot of teachers out there who are working every day to understand what the policy context is, and to work in terms of the practice. In terms of excellent practice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, the teaching of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, and also the teaching about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, histories, knowledges and perspectives, etc. So I'm just wondering if any of our panellists have got any insight into, I guess, holding, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? Holding your ground is probably the wrong word, but to continue to practice, use the policy as it stands to continue practicing in the correct way, I guess is my, not that there is one correct way. Do you know what I mean? To practice your pedagogy in a professional way, I guess, is probably the better way to put it. Peter.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, is that often we think that policy is no, not often we think policy is developed in a vacuum. And much like education, it's done to us in the profession. But I think what is not taken into consideration is the actual enactment of these policies at the classroom level or the pedagogical level. What does it actually mean that, you know, you have policy to actually now say you have to use, you know, these cross-curriculum collaborations in a CARA? How do you actually do that? I mean, we've got the policy, but is there an investment to actually teach, you know, or PD with the profession? How do I actually do that? You know, I mean, for me, that's a big disjoint in terms of a holistic approach, and we're not taught how to do that, you know, like in policies made by policy writers and experts in that space. And it comes down to, we are actually experts in our profession of teaching. So how do you actually make that connection so it is enacted at that classroom level? You know, like things like, you know, it could even be, you know, it could be quite simple things like who is Indigenous? How do you actually identify an Indigenous person? What is the difference between a lowercase I and an uppercase I when talking about Indigenous? This is in policy, but what does that actually mean in practice? I mean, that's a whole lesson you could do with kids in terms of unpacking that. And that's part of the history of their country, you know, and in these conversations. So I think, you know, and everyone is willing to do this because the policy we are compliant, you know, we know how to do it, but how do I actually do it well to the best of my ability and confidently?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I just, yeah, I completely agree about policies being developed in a vacuum, because some policies have the best intentions in the world, but they make very little impact on the ground or to the end user, which is ultimately sometimes the student, you know, boils down to student outcomes. So unless a policy is prioritised, and how does that then hit, you know, work its way down the system to then a regional level to be a part of, like, because I've seen regions where they prioritise system messages. So unless it's, you know, if it's, you know, some of the prioritisations has been around implementing the Australian curriculum, Year 12 attainment, and there's been very little that's been done around supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students or supporting teachers to be able to teach to and about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So, you know, there has to be something done at that systemic level to be able to ensure that the policies that are made at this level actually makes impact on the ground or to the end user that you know, that they're intended to impact.
Mm-hmm.
Can I jump? Yeah. No, this is a space that I'm amazed I have here at times, or I'm not going grey quicker. Some of the policies that we're constantly, you know, working with, the things like the Melbourne Education Declaration, and more recently the Sambono Education Declaration. That's where we see all of our ministers, you know, come together and make these very strong commitments towards how they're going to address this. And obviously, in those declarations, it's where we see a CARA being pointed to as the authority who's going to resolve some of this. So, you know, a CARA is going to produce a world-class curriculum, and in that curriculum, it's going to support teachers and identify the opportunities to do some of this learning to ensure that, you know, we understand that Australia is comprised of 2 broadly known First Nations groups and so on, and some of that stuff Peter was talking about. Where there's a bit of loss of translation is also knowing who's responsible for what, and sort of, if you go back and look at the ACARA Act and you see what the role and responsibility of the Australian curriculum is, it is strictly the development and the construction of curriculum. The implementation of it is a matter left in the hands of the jurisdictions, and it's an important distinction to know, and it's an important issue nationally in my world. When I first came to work for ACARA, you know, I'm a science teacher myself, So, you know, I was coming and going, hang on, we're doing all this high level stuff, but you're missing the point, you're missing the things that my colleagues need. And that's, you know, real world tangible resources, only to be met with, we're a CARA, we do not do that. That's the role of the jurisdiction. So it's an important thing about policy is to know, you know, who's responsible for what. And unfortunately in my career, I think I've quite often seen a bit of a ping pong battle between the jurisdictions and the authority and who does what. And there's almost a dance that goes on, oh, no, that's not my responsibility. And the other person says, well, that's not my responsibility. You should have done it. You know what I mean? And I think it has some not very nice outcomes. And that is, we don't, I mean, the Peter's talking about that, we actually don't have the actual, what's going to happen on the ground. Who are we supporting? I fought quite hard recently in that science space to have, number one, for us to live by the things like in the Environmental Education Declaration that, you know, we should see more of our things in science, for instance. But I always knew in my heart that what we could include in the elaborations was sort of not bookended with supporting an educator workforce that is the product of an education system that didn't give them this knowledge. So it's a bit of, you know, you've got to help them. So we were able in that space to walk a very fine line in Australian curriculum to produce what we call the teacher background information documents. And I hope most people get a chance to look at them, because they don't just apply to science, they apply to everything. But yeah, I just make the point, policy is the devil's in the detail.
Most certainly is. And I think a part of that detail, as Peter said, was building organisational consciousness. And I'm just thinking across our schools and our TAFE colleges and our early childhood education centres and universities. We can have a lot of policy around building educational confidence. In fact, I'll give you a real life example. I took myself off to the hospital for some shots the other week, and they had a big sign on the side of the health centre, the hospital, that said, "Are you Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander? We will ask you this question." And when I was standing there, the lady took all of my details and enrolled me into the hospital and didn't ask me the question. And I said, are you going to ask the question? And she said, no, what question? And I said, are you Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander? And she said, oh, well, are you? And I said, yes, I am. So I guess, you know, that's just a bit of a silly sort of example of how we tend to tie ourselves up with it. So if we're on one hand, we've got a policy statement that says we are going to do this, but on the other hand, we have got people at the first point of contact, or people who are the first point of contact, not aware of that sort of stuff. Then clearly we have, you know, an organisational culture that doesn't fit, and a lack of organisational consciousness, I guess. So how do we go about doing that work as practitioners?
I think, Darcel, if I can jump in, part of it is the definitional sort of work. And I could use an example, you know, just in that, you know, we have lots of policies and procedures that say that schools need to have a partnership and or engage with Aboriginal communities. Now that in and of itself, it's not like, you know, it's not like we're sitting around waiting for you fellas to come and talk to us. What does a partnership actually look like? How, you know, Aboriginal organisations and Aboriginal community groups, you know, we need the same partnerships that you would have with any other, you know, organisation. So there's a level of, you know, as I keep saying, we're not just waiting around and for, you know, 5 or 10 kids from, you know, a faculty of education, because there was a policy one time when I was in Victoria that lesson plans should be checked by a community organisation. So they're all rocking up to the health service in Fitzroy or everywhere else. And, you know, these services are actually, you know, at the front line of doing things. And it's like, well, can you check my lesson plan that I'm doing something? And this person's a health practitioner. It's like, what? You know, so I think there's a lot of definitional work, and it's like, how do I do this? Even as a classroom practitioner, you know what I mean? Like, how do I, it's like, you know, these things actually happen with conversations with people in community, and knowing who knowledgeable experts are, who are Indigenous people or First Nations peoples, who are also educators. They know what you're talking about. You know what I mean? And you can say, oh, this is what I need. And, you know, I think that there's that next level of sophistication in terms of drilling down. And sometimes I think it's not, you know, I always go, it's not rocket science. It's like, just be normal, but no. It's like, what does this actually mean? And how do I actually do it? You know, is something that I see a bit of a gap, particularly in the engagement space. Yeah.
Carly?
Yeah, I guess for me it's you know, when we look for solutions in Indigenous education, and we all know as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that we have solutions ourselves, and you know, and I feel like this conversation is just it's a constant, and I just don't feel like there is the eyes and the ears to be able to support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, you know, designing and developing their own solutions, because there's been many efforts in the past to do that. I worked in a region with the Department of Education where, despite, you know, I was constantly fighting every day to be able to prioritise Indigenous education for my mob, and it was an emotional journey for me because they were my people. And you know, having to put up with the casual racism and the prioritisation of other strategies other than our own for our kids is what kind of got, you know, beat me down. So we had a whole team that was designing all of these fantastic approaches and enhancing teacher practice and ensuring pre-service teachers understood the brief when they were going in for remote service, or they were, you know, induction for school leaders going into our remote schools. But it was just kind of, it was pushed to the side because it wasn't a system message priority. And I just felt like no one was listening to us at that time. And then when this opportunity came up with AITSL, it was an opportunity to impact at a national level again. And the amount of conversations that we've had with the profession, with teachers and school leaders through this piece of work, like, there's so much goodwill and intent. And I just don't understand how a region like that, which a third of the student population were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, that they just didn't prioritise it. And I just don't understand where we go wrong with that. And when you hear from other jurisdictions that, you know, it's such a priority for them, they're screaming out for help, and they want to learn more. They want to understand what the issues are in, you know, kids getting into classrooms and keeping them there. So I just don't know how we address some of those policy issues to be able to, you know, target those students that really need the intervention and the support that they need, including their families and their communities.
Thanks, Carly. And Joe?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking about some of Carly's comments, and I was thinking, you know, one of the things we're hearing a lot of now is the need for cultural responsiveness, you know, and the other term we hear flying around education space at the moment is we can't do anything without an evidence base. And I'm sure Peter would agree with me. We're probably considered the most research mob, you know, ever. You know what I mean? And there's more evidence about you know, us in education than you could ever hope for. But it seems sometimes, where's the willingness or the ability to change practice, to change outcome? I mean, we constantly see the monitoring of the gaps and so on, and it doesn't matter what measure we apply, you know, PISA, TIMS or NAPLAN or so on. The frustrating part is, you know, even in those settings that Carly's talking about, where the practice hasn't shifted. You know, I had the luck the honour to work, you know, to design a program once for the CSIRO. And part of the main elements I included in the program was to help educators recognise that if we don't listen to the data, if we don't actually see that there's a 2.5, 3 year lag in various literacies, you know, whatever it is, we need to consider, well, what's the impact on our assessment strategies, on how we collect evidence of understanding and so on. So one of the aspects we put in there was, well, we wanted to be culturally responsive with our pedagogical approaches. So we were using things like hands-on inquiry, because we know that works, and it works for all students. And the other aspect was then to start coming up with more novel ways of collecting evidence and having a portfolio of our students' work. You know, so here we are, you know, 2021 now. We've got more technology than we know what to do with or can use, and we can now use multimodal ways. So I'm not saying abandon literacy. I'm not saying that we don't work to address some of the deficits, but it's no good constantly putting nails in students' education coffins by failing us all the time. You need to give us a chance to actually show that we know, you know, what we're doing, and not confuse, you know, literacy issues with cognitive issues, you know, and give us those chances. So some of the work there we were able to do was to be culturally responsive, was to encourage educators to change their practice about how they assess their students. And it was great to see they immediately saw that, you know, if you were able to use an iPad or a computer or something, and you were able to have students come up with novel ways of showing their understanding, do a selfie for science or make a little vignette or a little video, the students would you know, they were surprising their teachers. You know, if you asked the teacher what they were expecting they would get out of that student, they were expecting an E in science, when actually they had a C and up, and you know, a standard of in that area. But yeah, so no, it's frustrating at times when you hear all of these things, evidence-based and cultural responsiveness. I struggle with and you know, you're going to hear, and I'm sure everyone listening will know well, that our inclusion often in curriculum matters is at the non-mandatory level. And that, I think, has an impact in these matters as well. But anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you. And I guess the sort of mandated nature of curriculum, or the mandated nature of anything, really brings me into the sort of notion of, and just looking at some of the things that people have been writing on the screen, issues around truth-telling, issues around systems responsiveness, issues around individual responsiveness, and I think, you know, Carly's comment earlier, which resonated with me, which is, you know, the issue of racism in schools, issues that are not being addressed in a comprehensive way, in my view, at the moment. Issues particularly of racism, you know, I guess we've seen, I'm not going to name the schools, but there have been a number of schools recently in the media that have had issues with, for a variety of reasons, issues with incidents of racism in the schools. And then there are also the issues that we have of systemic racism, including the policy churn, including the sort of, what's the word, the conversation around the deficit, or ongoing conversation, never-ending conversation around the deficiencies of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, but not the conversation about building a rich curriculum and a rich an expert profession that can respond to needs appropriately. So I'm going to, I'll go to, well, let's go in the same order again, Peter, Carly and Joe, and then we'll flick to questions from the audience, and I'll pass back to you. Thanks, Karina. So Professor, please.
Yeah, look, so many things that we've, you know, and that, you know, my sector is guilty of, is the sort of the collecting of evidence that just keeps going around and round in circles, that perpetuates this sort of fatigue and having, you know, and our people and our communities, we have, you know, a history of educative trauma. Our schools were used to take us away to be white. Then there's racism. Then there's all of these issues. I mean, you know, teaching your kids when they're going into prep that someone's going to say something to you and you don't hit them and they're going to be mean to you because you'll get in trouble. That's racism. Who, you know, teaching babies how to actually strategies to survive at school is one thing. And, you know, and I always think about this is that, you know, we don't live in a cultural vacuum. We are all cultured beings. Everyone has a culture, and, you know, so how do you, you know, and I always think, how do we send, if you took the tag off this culture tag, because when you say cultural practice or cultural responsiveness, it becomes the other and it becomes a choice. So if you take that tag off, and how do we center it? This is just what it means to be an Australian, and teaching civics and citizenship, teaching all of those areas. It becomes embedded and centralized. You know, Emeritus Professor Jeannie Herbert has a really good paper that's, you know, how to recenter the decentered, you know, and then it becomes a consciousness issue of, you know, it's just what you do, you know, and I just sort of, I always think about that and, you know, how do we do that? But, you know, I think that's the way. It's like, it's part of this our professional practice, and it becomes a pedagogical issue for us as practitioners, I think. How do we do that? How do we honor that? How do we honor all of our students, you know, and all the different cultures that make up this, you know, this country that is Australia, you know? So yeah, that's my, you know, my sort of challenge.
Yeah, for me, I think about our mob. I think about the cultural burden that our Indigenous education workers, our CECs, our CESOs are faced with on a daily basis to be the cultural authorities and to teach the non-Indigenous teachers and staff about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. When, you know, teachers and school leaders need to be enhancing their own knowledges and developing their own knowledges around this. So if they keep relying on our mob in schools, then they're not developing professionally. They're not being given the opportunity to be able to understand it and unpack that a little bit more, so that it gives them the confidence to be able to teach Indigenous content. Because the excuses of have a fear of offending, of a fear that I'm just going to, you know, it's paralysing for some. So for some people, some teachers rather, just need to understand that they shouldn't rely on their Indigenous education workers to be able to be the cultural authorities in their schools. I had an experience with a school in the region I worked in where, you know, a non-Indigenous student would present themselves at the reception. He's got a cut knee. So they would send him to the school nurse. When the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander kid presents himself, they get sent off to the CEC. So the CEC or the CESOs or the Indigenous education workers become the school nurse, the behaviour officer, the truancy officer. They become this whole kit and caboodle of dealing with all the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander students. And so where are the teaching staff developing and enhancing their own knowledges about learning about Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people? So I've just, you know, I feel for our mob out in those schools that are just churning in and day out and putting up with, you know, that type of treatment from within those schools framework. So there needs to be some cultural safety around that. So I think some of the challenges around that is in valuing and centering what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander bring to the system.
Thank you, Sis. And Joe?
Yeah, I like what Peter said about the recentering the decentered, was it? The recentering the decentered. I mean, I often think of that in terms of ensuring whatever practice we're trying to do can work in a mainstream setting, because often what works for our mob works for all. You know what I mean? It's not a culture-based education model at times. But the thing that I always think in these situations is, you know, we've got to look at these things in two ways. We've got to look at the people of today, the incumbent educators and our kids of today. And then we've got to look at the pipeline. And one thing I'm certain of is that I think I've said it to some of you before. You're probably sick of, some of you will be sick of me saying it, but I think having an Australian curriculum is a new era in education in this country. And I think it brings with it a really unique opportunity since, certainly since colonisation. Let's not dismiss our knowledges and our education models that have sustained us for longer than any other culture in this planet. But since colonisation, this is our biggest probably opening for us to have a voice and a say in some way nationally. And what I think it can do is it can start breaking these cycles. And I hope maybe in 50 years' time, the people who enrol in to become educators of the future won't be carrying this baggage, or won't have these deficits of knowledge and practice themselves. And I think, again, it's without sounding like that Utopia TV show, there is a nation building aspect to these things, without taking the mickey, it really is. And it is at that level of importance. Yeah.
Thank you. And I agree, it is very much at that level of importance. I think, for us as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, certainly from my family and my community, the more people sit down and want to share, they want people to know what they know, and they're prepared to wait to tell you, there's a knowledge-based culture. So I will now pass back to Karina to facilitate any questions and answers from the participants. I'd just like to thank everyone for their active involvement on the chat while we've been talking as well. It's been really great. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Darcel. And thanks so much to our panelists for your contributions so far. We've got a number of questions in the chat function. I think what we might do is I'll direct them to one or the other of you, but feel free if you've got a particular view to jump in if you want to make a contribution. So Peter, I've got a question for you, I think, which is a sort of a systemic question, and this comes from Margaret in terms of developing policy that's meaningful for First Nations peoples and the education of our students in terms of how that can be achieved, particularly around how we can ensure governments and departments of education and schools work in collaboration with TOs, Indigenous educators, parents and communities. Over to you.
Sorry, I've been in a WebEx today, so I'm looking for the mute button. I think, look, as a researcher and sometimes someone who develops these sorts of things, one of the things, as I said earlier, is that policy is always done reactively. We never develop policy for sustainability. And if we're actually talking about big change with community, and Darcel, you were involved in that project with AETSL, is that we actually consulted probably for a whole year to ensure that every local Aboriginal education consultative group had their input into the project. And then we came back and checked and it's like, this is what you've all said. Are you all okay with that? I think the consultation is key. If you actually, and we as community members and the mob, we then feel that we're valued and our voices and our views are actually seen in these policies. But so many times it's actually reactive. And what I think we've seen is that the reactive approach doesn't work because the policy just gets wrapped around again, a new government comes in, etc. So I really do think it's collecting the voices and actually saying, no, we have to do it. The time, it's that time that to actually create change, we need to do this. We need to fund it. That's the other thing. We need investment into it. And not just, like, oh, there's, a couple of grand sitting in a bucket. Make it a line item. This is what we're going to do. I think that's really what it is.
Thanks, Peter. I'm really pleased you mentioned the investment word because, of course, in terms of every school and every child, that's a critical issue for us around funding, systemic funding, and who actually takes responsibility for that in terms of you know, there's a whole range of things that back off of that, not only engagement of our students and young people, but properly skilling the workforce with respect to that. All right, I think we've got a question for you, Joe. This comes from Anissa, who is working in TAFE, and she's talking about the problem stemming from the design of assessments for TAFE and uni that aren't written by mob, and decisions about curriculum in schools and PD in schools also being decided by non-Aboriginal people, and not to mention non-Aboriginal people being supported to deliver training in cultural competence. What are your thoughts?
Geez, there's not much I can say other than to everything I agree. We've all experienced exactly those things. I'm going to attend some type of webinar tomorrow where one of the first questions I'm going to ask is, why isn't someone from the respective community present? These are they're sort of, although they're fundamental issues, they're the sort of everyday issues we fight in this space, I guess, is our voice in the space. You know, where is, you know, the pushing back against paternal sort of efforts, you know, and it's a balance, I guess. How do you whilst we want to encourage good work and we want to encourage people in our space, how do we make it clear that, you know, when it, you know, I always think of that saying, nothing about us without us, you know, and I think we maybe we need t-shirts and we just need to wear them every day, you know, for people to get the hint gently. I don't know. Yeah. So.
Thanks, Joe. Carly, got one for you. This is around a question about how schools can be more culturally responsive to the needs of teachers in curriculum delivery and improving classroom practices for our students. What are your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, a lot of the feedback that we're getting through our consultation process around the cultural competency work is that there's myriad resources available to teachers, but the discernment of the quality of those resources, particularly curriculum resources, is what is giving teachers a little bit of a how can I say it politely? Because we always talk about turning, you know, having these excuses and turning them into opportunities. And teachers are touching Indigenous content purely because they don't feel that they have the appropriate resources. So I think there's some work to be done around how we work with curriculum resources, how teachers can develop and implement the Australian curriculum through resources that already exist. So it's a process that we're kind of working in with the work that we're doing around the cultural competence, because it came up on a number of occasions. So it's something that it was a dominant theme throughout this whole process. So it's something that we need to throw a bit more of a lens over. The other one was around having access to appropriate professional development and professional learning. Because like I said earlier on, you know, the prioritisation of system messages seem to then prioritise what teachers are exposed to in terms of PD and PL. So, and then, you know, just the development of appropriate professional development and professional learning within schools and regions who are responsible for that. So, you know, we're looking at AITSL's looking at developing resources and tools a bit more high level in terms of, you know, critical reflection tools and, you know, capability frameworks to help teachers be able to move themselves through a continuum. So, yeah, I think there's a range of things that are, you know, some really best practice that's happening at the moment. And, you know, the process that we're working through with the cultural competency work is about surfacing and building on some of that.
Yeah, okay, great. Thanks, Carly. Peter, this is a question really from me. I'll take some liberty here as chair, but I'm interested, you know, much of the conversation tonight has also really highlighted that issue of cultural burden that is experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people working in education. And in your presentation earlier, you mentioned, I think, the number 26 people working in sort of academia, you know, currently, and it really highlights for me the issue of attracting and retaining Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in terms of initial teacher education. So I'll start with you in terms of your thoughts about perhaps some of the challenges systemically, and then come to you, Carly and Joe, for a contribution on that as well, particularly in the context of Matsidi perhaps, and the fact that we don't have funding for programs such as that currently from the government.
Look, this is a real conundrum in the sector. And for some reason, I don't know, the occupational health and safety laws don't apply to Aboriginal people in the classroom. You just have to roll with it. Why are we not protected by that? You know what I mean? When you have these conversations with your line manager, then suddenly it's, oh, it's in your head, or you didn't really mean it. Aboriginal people at the front of the classroom or standing in front of 200 students who have to do an in-depth unit to get registration, the level of vitriol that you can feel coming off these students and resentment, I would not put junior academics into that space to let you actually need those skills as a senior academic to be able to actually navigate that. And I think we're always held to account on policy and practice, but when we actually call on an organisation or an educational organisation to invoke that occupational health and safety and creating a safe working environment, suddenly it's like, oh, it's really difficult. You sure? That's the inequity here that I see constantly. If all Aboriginal educators have a story around this, I went to school and I've just left with a huge headache, but we have to turn up the next day. And we turn up, and I think that's what it is. It's like, and also the professional development, having it as a line item. If you're a school leader, that's a line item. Why did you not spend that money? Or I got bulk funding specifically for Indigenous, but I went into the bucket and I've used it for something else. I've used it for EpiPen training or whatever. We need to actually have these things itemised and leaders held to account. Why didn't you do this? We need to find out why people are leaving the profession and do something about it. That's my sort of things. We need to use the tools that are there to actually protect us, but they're not used. But yeah.
Thank you. Carly?
My thing has always been about having culturally safe practices, like recruitment practices. What kind of, when you're looking at the disposition of a teacher when they're either entering a school with a high Indigenous student population, entering an Indigenous community with, doing some remote service, and the lack of induction that's done for some of our teachers that are, first time remote service teachers, has always kind of, it's kind of stumped me. Why we wouldn't give them, when executive principals come in, they're fully inducted. They have I think they spend 3 or 4 days in the regional office to be able to understand the environment they're entering into, the school dynamics, the diversity that they're going to be dealing with. So it just kind of stumps me how we're not kind of looking after our, pre-service and our beginner teachers when they're either doing their, going into their practicals or they're actually, going into service. And I had a teacher say to us that she doesn't, deliver Indigenous content because it wasn't a part of her teacher education. So we were talking about blind spots for some teachers. So that question sticks with me throughout the whole conversation that we had. That question kind of stuck with me. Or why do we have to be culturally competent if we don't have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in our classrooms? So it's about enhancing the knowledge of our teachers. And I think we need to also consider what our students bring to the classroom, and valuing and centering their culture, their language, their history. It's just, I think there's some really simple kind of approaches that that teachers need to, or should consider. But like I said, it's a part of a systemic kind of issue that we're dealing with, and it needs further consideration. Absolutely.
Thanks. And Joe?
you know, for our mob as educators, you know, I'm a zoologist, but you know, by training, and I always think of the flamingo effect. If you keep a flamingo by itself in the zoo, it becomes very unhappy and depressed. You know, you need, and the more flamingos around it, the happier it gets. And I think it's a lonely place as a blackfellow in education. I think some of that Matt Seedy findings was, I think we represent slightly over 1% of the educator workforce. I think it was something like that. I think, have we made 10,000 educators nationally? I'm not sure, but it's small numbers. But in a former life, I was constantly working in the STEM realm and trying to, you know, there's a continued push to see our mob in STEM, just like there's a continued push to see us in education as being teachers. And it makes me think of the issues in the pipeline. You know what I mean? Like the equivalent of an apprenticeship in STEM and as an educator is you need a degree. You need a bachelor's degree. And I've shouted this from the rooftops on many occasions. If you were to look at each jurisdiction and look at retention rates, and you were to start looking at where our education outcomes and who's eligible for an ATAR, and the herding of our mob into the vet pathways and the alternative pathways, which I'm not saying we should stop those pathways, but we are, if you were to compare, you know, 1,000 of us to 1,000 non-Indigenous or non-First Nations students, you see some very disparate outcomes in terms of your ability to go to university. So the catchment that we get each year to go into initial teacher, it must be infinitely small. And I think my desires is to improve our outcomes, our education outcomes in schools, to see us starting to compete with and be represented at the same percentage levels of people who can go to university. Our choice at the end of education should not be any different, and I don't think that's the case at the moment. Our choices are, I mean, I'm a product of the VETS pathways. I'm very thankful that I was able to get through there, but late blooming, as we often know it, late blooming comes with many risks, and that could mean a kid could come along in your life. There's lots of things to derail you if you're not amongst the cohort with everyone else going through the school ed system. So yeah, but yeah, I'd love to see more of our mob teaching.
Thank you so much. I've got a question here from Jasmine Carley. This was in response to your presentation, so I'll direct this one to you. It says, until First Nations people are constitutionally empowered with an enshrined voice, can things really change across institutions? Do we need to push an abolitionist approach where students thrive and not just survive? It's a big question. You're on mute.
Oh, that was really deadly what I just said. Got to start again. I think, yeah, Jasmine, that was in response to when I was talking about the cultural burden that our mob experience in our schools, and because when I was talking about it, that message popped up and it was like, yes, Carly, like I think I have these yes moments with a lot of people when we talk about how can we change these institutions that are responsible for the outcomes of our kids. And I did work in a system where it was a struggle for me on a daily basis, but we're just supporting our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education workers to be able to get access to the support that they needed. But it was also about fighting the system to get them understanding of this is the fundamentals of what our kids need. This is the fundamentals of what schools need to be able to do to support teachers to teach our, and provide an environment for our kids to be able to succeed. And there are some great schools that are out there that are doing some fantastic things. And there are some that are just performative and quite tokenistic. So, when we talk about Indigenous, some things in Indigenous education we just can't mandate, which is teaching our true history in the curriculum. community engagement. You know, these things, some things we just can't measure, and that seems to be the priority for some systems, to be able to only focus on those measurables like school attendance, Year 12 attainment and whatnot. So I think it's, you know, by providing, you know, we do need to empower our families and our communities on the ground, because at the end of the day, that's the only way that these systems are going to ever listen to us.
Thanks, Carly. We've got about 10 minutes left for questions, and we've got quite a few, so we're going to speed through as many as we can. If you've put a statement in the chat, I'm just going to leave that as a statement rather than reading that out. But I think this one's for you, Jo. This is from Paul. I'm interested to hear people's thoughts about how we can prevent Indigenous education and perspectives not being taught as an afterthought or a bolt-on to curriculum.
Yeah, this is a common criticism from our mob and the other end is that lack of authenticity in what's occurring. Again, it's a complex. It's more complex than it initially seems, and it's, again, the devil's in the detail, and partly is because, and I know you're going to want me to hurry up here, but the cross-curriculum priority, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures cross-curriculum priority, has two needs. It's not as simple as this is about us. It's actually, it has two components. One of it's about us. It's about increasing the engagement factor of the curriculum. It's trying to stop it from being a disengaging, alienating, aspect. If you're studying science, what's it mean? What's this connection to me? What has this got to do with it? So there's that aspect in which you normally see in content elaborations, non-mandatory inclusions. Whereas when you start looking at the other need, which is to ensure all Australians learn about who our First Nations mobs are, because these are those two needs that are determined by the Sambono Education Declaration and the Melbourne Declaration before, then it's the one about us. It's the one to ensure all Australians know. And you'll notice that in places like HASS and in the arts, you'll see that it's at a mandatory level. It's in the content descriptions, and that ensures that every student around the nation should learn about, in Year 10, the rights and freedoms of our mobs and so on. So I know this is a long way of saying it. So I think the first thing I've tried to do in the Australian curriculum is to point this out and say to them, every time I see a content elaboration about us that's last, you send me the wrong signal. You need to address that, number one. So one of the ways that I've put forward is that we try and, where possible, put them front and center. That would be one challenge. And the other places that we've been lobbying, which is another very kind, I'm not going to be able to explain it all to you here. Another complex place is about challenging for inclusion in the achievement standards and in the mandatory space. And that is a very complex and filled with landmines. So I'm not sure if I've answered that very well for you, but it is complex. It is something we all know about. Again, I think the curriculum is being reviewed as we speak, and I think we will see improvements in that space. You're going to get a chance to look at I think the curriculum will go live on the 29th of April for the public consultation period, and I hope you'll see some improvements in that sense, and I hope those improvements flow down to schools around Australia.
Thanks, Jo. I've got a question from Rebecca. I'll direct this one to you, Peter. Rebecca's a Torres Strait Islander woman and also a primary school teacher. And she says, I'm finding it difficult to further my knowledge, education and training to better my teaching and pedagogy. I'm told by my principal that I have an amount of funding. I sign up for Connecting to Country course and then told the school won't pay for the course because it's not needed for my teaching role and so on. So she's feeling like everywhere she turns, it's becoming harder and harder to further knowledge of her culture. It's so sad. How can I further my knowledge when there are so many obstacles?
Thank you. I think there's also, and this probably ties back to Carly and Jo as well, and what they were talking about, is that we're forgetting, I think, the fundamental essence of who we are and what we do as practitioners. Pedagogy actually creates change. Curriculum is the lever over here that, if you can teach something well, you can actually create change. And if you have that cultural knowledge from the Torres Strait, you know, it's through the power of embedding that into your pedagogical practice, I think. And I think that's where we sort of, you know, as a profession, we forget, you know, the power that we actually have to facilitate children's learning or learners learning to do this. We have, and you can see it in investment, like, you know, lots and lots of curriculum resources, but how do we actually teach that? And I think that is something that we all have innate within us in our own professional practice. And if we are doing something well, just with our classroom, just with who we have, our little people, that is actually change, you know what I mean? But I would also come back to that and say that school leader should actually, you know, reassess their priorities and sort of, you know, if it's in Queensland, that is something that you have to actually be offered, you know, and then it becomes the value, you know, of what you know, I'd say it's the value of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Let's make it about money. Everyone knows about money. You don't value me. Let's see, if I want to put a cost value, you are not valuing me then. You know, so there's those things. But I really think as practitioners, though, the power is in our pedagogies and how we are actually taking our learners on this journey in our classrooms. Whilst we're not at that constitutional recognition areas, etc., and all of these things floating around, we actually have control of what happens in our learning environment. You know, and I think that's the power that we all can harness, each and every one of us. You know, imagine that all through a school, people just doing it, the change of these learners. But yeah, that's my hope.
Thanks, Peter. Joe, here's another one for you from Loris. As a high school teacher, I see Indigenous student engagement wane as they progress through grades, especially males. Does senior syllabus adequately address Indigenous content and awareness? And subsequently, is cross-curriculum enough within the junior years to help direct teaching practices?
Yeah, again, familiar, sad story that we see hearing, and we do definitely see it happening in boys more. I can only guess and talk about my own journey through school. But again, if we go back to the evidence we see in PISA and TIMS and NAPLAN and so on, that you're carrying a literacy deficits of 2.5 to 3 years. But I think as you get older, they catch up with you. You know what I mean? That it just, as the demands on you in these learning areas to grasp not just the English language, to start grasping subject-specific language like in science and things, it just gets harder and harder. And in my case, I think I expressed some of those things in poor behaviour. You know, it was a way to disguise these things and so on. And to the point where, you know, your presence at school is no longer really wanted, you know, and it's not a space for you. So, yeah, and your point of is it enough in that F to 6 or that middle school space? And I totally agree. I think we should be doing more. And I think Peter's on the money in terms of, you know, we should be looking at our pedagogy for some of the answers to this, because I always use science because that was my passion. But if I think about how science was taught me, it was completely, you know, any of your passion for science and inquiry is knocked out of you. You know, it's so first day of year 8, we teach the kids to recall the first 20 elements of a periodic table. If we want to engage our at-risk learners, we have to be on our games as educators. We have to really do well with our pedagogy and make sure we're engaged. We have chances for success. We can be a bit self-determined. We can use, you know, open-ended inquiry and have some agency in our learning and these sorts of things. I think has to be some of the ways. And again, this comes back to AITSL and some of the work that'll come out of there is helping us as a profession improve some of our standards and responsiveness to those needs.
Thanks, Joe. There's one final question which I think really flows on from what you've just said, and that is, how can we assess First Nations students in a way that's not holding them to standards that were never designed for them, really off the back of your presentation earlier. Do you have a couple of quick comments on that note?
Yeah, look, I think you know, again, the challenge of an Australian curriculum is that it has to work nationally. So it has to work in the Pilbara, and it has to work in the burbs of Brisbane, you know, supposedly, you know, if that's the model. So you hope that we don't need to see an achievement standard that is culturally delineated. You know, it shouldn't. It should be about. I hope that the Australian curriculum is about learning those 8 learning areas to empower you to join the prosperity of this nation. I mean, these are the things that were fought for and cried for by people like someone help me with the name here, 1938. Peter, quickly, it'll come to me. You know, some of our old forefathers in education were calling for a full education. You know, they were saying we need. You can't blame us for not joining the economies and things like this if we're not in education. So I know it's a long way of saying it. I think the achievement standard has to work for us, you know, and we have to, as educators, it's a bit like the pedagogy approach. We have to find a way to ensure that because people like ACARA do not determine how you collect the evidence of understanding. No, I mean, we're often locked in a tradition of how we collect evidence. You know, a written test or an essay is not determined by the Australian curriculum. You know, these are often local decisions, school decisions, regional decisions, jurisdictional decisions, and I would probably go back and look at some of that. But yeah, sorry, that's probably a long way of saying it. I could talk more, but I won't. I'll shut up.
Thanks, Joe. So now we're almost at a close, and so for our final contribution from each of our panelists, I'm going to ask you a question which is from Harriet, but it's really very relevant to us as a union, and that is, if you could leave us with one thing tonight, what is it that you think the AEU federally and our union at a branch, you know, at a state and territory level should be doing or advocating for as a key priority? So Peter, let's start with you in closing.
Okay, I think that, you know, we need to be, or Indigenous, whatever it needs to be in the school ledger, it needs to be actually front and centre as line items. These are the programs we're going to do. Then we need to report back and say, why didn't you do it? You know, and I also think, you know, just this conversation and watching these questions is actually, you know, really ramping up the value of the profession and the value of individuals. That, you know, we actually do have that power, and we actually can do that, and we can mobilize. And, you know, sometimes we get caught up with funding, and, you know, and I think also changing the discourse. Do we keep throwing money at deficit sort of things around school attendance? But why don't we actually fund school excellence, Indigenous gifted kids? Why are they represented these you know, I think that the paradigm has to shift in terms of where the investment goes as such. But that's it. But my main thing is just keep going. You can do it. We're an awesome profession.
We are, absolutely. Thank you. Carly.
Yeah, I would just like, you know, even in my own work is to bring teachers on a journey with us. Like, we're doing this together. And that, you know, it's about enhancing teacher practice. It's not it's not an add-on. It's, you know, Indigenous education should not be seen as an add-on. You know, we have some fantastic, beautiful kids within our system, and they have a right to a deadly education as well. So, you know, and they can't get that unless our teachers are performing at their best. So enhancing teacher practice and in making sure that culture is embedded in the schools and the classrooms, and that the, you know, teachers are, you know, have the right knowledge and the confidence to be able to teach it to, you know, to all students, not just, you know, having special practices for our kids, but for all kids.
Thanks, Carly. And Joe?
Yeah, agree with all. For me, same thing. PL and resources. You know, like culturally vetted, the equivalent of the Heart Foundation's tick of approval, cultural tick of approval, resources that educators can use. I think most educators really have a desire to incorporate the cross-curricular priorities, but don't have the time or the expertise to develop, you know, a culturally vetted and appropriate materials. That would be a great help. You know.
Thanks very much, Jo. And Darcel, I'd just like to offer you the opportunity if there's anything you'd like to say before we close the session this evening.
I just want to pay homage and tribute to the intellectual capacity of my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues here, and to say thank you so much for taking your time to join us tonight. We're very pleased to have hosted this this conversation, and to everybody who's still with us at this late hour, thank you very much for staying, and keep your eye out because we'll be hosting a few more of these panel discussions on different subjects throughout the year.
Thanks, Darcel. Thanks to Peter, Carly and Jo for your fantastic contributions. Thanks to all of the colleagues who've joined us this evening for this very important conversation. It's been our privilege to walk together this evening, to learn together this evening, and this is the beginning of, as Darcel has said, a series of conversations that we intend to have this year, and I look forward to seeing you in future webinars. Thank you so much and good evening.